Thanks, Nathan. So I want to start by saying a big thanks to the organisers of tonight. So Nathan and Kev and everyone involved in Software City and in Sunderland Digital for giving me the chance to speak tonight. So big thanks, obviously, to everyone is enjoying the refreshments and the pizza. So I'm looking forward to that later on. Again, thanks for putting those on. So yeah, as Nathan said, I'm Tim. I'm a product designer working in Teesside for a company called Clicksco. We work on a product called Carbon at the minute, which is kind of an audience management platform. So we work with agencies and publishers to better understand their users, essentially. So how can they optimize their content, their ad inventory, their essential online portfolio to better understand their users and provide them with the content they desire. So that's a bit about me. Realize I've skipped some of that, but just a bit more content. So the talk tonight is going to touch on kind of experiences I've had over the past few years working with various companies and various product teams. So I've taken a lot of taken away a few kind of pointers from these that I've learned, maybe what's not worked so well for me, what's kind of worked well, and hopefully kind of how these can be applied in practice. And I hope that we can discuss afterwards, and you might take some value from these as well. So kind of a brief overview. I worked with a fairly large TV broadcaster for a number of years within their online service department. So this was working with product teams delivering kind of account management for customers, giving them an easy way to manage their accounts, manage their package, manage anything to do with their kind of TV and broadband account. The reason for doing that, there was a big driver around call deflection. So there's a huge cost attributed to every time a customer picks up a phone, as far as kind of the call center functionality and things. But not only that, there's a huge cost on the customer having to do that, having to sit on hold, having to go through that process when they know they need a problem fixed straight away. From then, I kind of spent some time in the public sector looking at kind of loan assessment. So particularly working with the student loans company in Darlington with their internal assessment teams. So spent around a year working with them to try and optimize the process of kind of the loan applications coming in, the software used to process those applications and ultimately provide students with finance. So there's a fairly big burden on that one. So I'll kind of touch on some of the experiences there. And as I've mentioned at the minute, kind of working on Carbon. Yeah, let's get into it. So the title of the talk is around measuring design success. So we can't look at that without addressing kind of what success is. It's a fairly subjective term, I believe, and it varies in context from kind of area to area. What success for one company isn't success for another. But let's kind of start with the trusted source. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines success as an accomplishment of an aim or a purpose. So still fairly broad. But in terms of product and design success, I'd like to add a little bit onto the end of that and say that it also achieves an outcome. So I'll be touching on various outcomes from these measures as we go through. But I believe it's kind of an important distinction to make, that not only are you achieving a purpose, you're also having an impact or an outcome, particularly on a user's experience. So what is good design? It's highly subjective. Design is a field. It's difficult to kind of objectively say what is good, what isn't. But when you're talking about measuring successful design, I think it's important to stick to some kind of key metrics, key indicators of how you can define what is good for your particular context. But I will turn to the Don. Anyone's familiar with this guy, you know he's a bit of a legend in the field. So kind of Don would say that the two most important characteristics of good design tend to be discoverability and understanding. So fairly broad terms, but something you can apply to most scenarios. So can the user discover a feature, for example, and can they understand how to use it? It's a fairly good concept to live by, I think. So the design is an iterative process. There's probably a common diagram that crops up now and again, but things definitely evolve. And as you know, within our field, within the tech industry, things are never done, I suppose. So design is no different in that sense. So it's important to kind of know that the MVP you ship is not going to be the final product. But then again, what is final? So there's always that cycle. So I thought it's important to kind of keep that in mind during this talk. And measurement itself, I found this to be quite an effective quote. So, if you can't measure something, then essentially you can't control it. And if you can't control it, then you can't improve on it, is the way I kind of see it. So always being able to quantify the things that you do is a helpful kind of needle to work by, I think. So we've discussed a few definitions. I'd like to now jump into the process of how these might be applied and how we can get the best value from these. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a fairly special trio. And like most trios, they're strong individually, but great when they come together. Probably says a lot about me that I've chosen these three, but this is the trio of design measures. And let's dive right in. So the first measure we're going to touch on is user satisfaction. So as we all know, the user should be central to every decision that we make when it comes to design and kind of product development. So ensuring that the user is satisfied. At a basic level, the user knows what's going on, but also if we start to talk about things like delight, how can we improve their experience to kind of make sure that the user is completely satisfied in what they are doing. The second measure is around company performance. So I guess without this, we can't really function. So it's great getting those user needs down, but also tying those into the business goals is also the other side of that circle to make sure that they are intertwined and that we are achieving that company performance. And the third measure being around team maturity. So this is something we've started kind of investing in heavily a lot at Clicksco, and it's around kind of how can you improve your immediate team, not only the design function, but also the wider product team. How can you ensure that you are moving forward? So I feel that not only should you make sure your products are effective for your users, you should make sure kind of internally you're working well as a team and kind of achieving the right results. So the first measure, user satisfaction. As I say, it's important to start with the user, and understanding the user's needs is obviously paramount, because if there's no problem there to solve, there can be no solution effectively. So I'm just going to kind of run through a few techniques to identify these. This is the approach taken from kind of the lean UX movement. So Jet Gottlieb, and Josh Seedon are kind of big proponents of using kind of rapid hypothesis, rapid personas to almost initially make some assumptions around your users. It's often seen as a bad thing that's done, but I think it's a good way to kind of get started and actively try to disprove those assumptions in order to find the correct motivations of your users, for example. So to fill in the blanks, essentially this is a guide that centers around what we believe doing, what we want to do essentially, and for who, crucially, and focusing on the outcome. So by doing so, we will achieve this. And personally, I feel this last line is probably the most important aspect, because we need to know when we are successful. So by looking at user behavior, adoption rates, kind of retention, that kind of thing, we will know these outcomes that we've achieved. I've kind of met our goal. So testing these hypotheses, I'm going to kind of look at a technique that I've used in the past, and it's during usability testing. So we've kind of skipped a few phases there, but if we've got a prototype that we're testing with users, obviously we're looking for we're observing how the user's interacting with the product. We're looking to pick up on signals of if things are working, kind of length taken to accomplish tasks, various pieces of signal. But additional to that, kind of adding in short surveys. So I know surveys often get a bad rap, and I feel as kind of a qualitative tool, it can be quite effective when coupled with this kind of observation work. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of short surveys that I've used in the past to fairly great effect. So I'll break these down into two sections. So we've got test level satisfaction, and we have task level satisfaction. Slightly important distinction to make there. So the first one I'll touch on is test level, and one that I've used in the past is the SUS survey, essentially, and this is the system usability scale. Just as a show of hands, has anyone came across this tool in the past? Great. Okay, so we've got one. So yeah, it's essentially it's a 10-question survey based on the Likert scale. So I think it's a five option per question, and essentially it focuses around usability of the product. So the reason I say it's important to use it straight after usability testing, in my experience, is because that experience is fresh in the user's mind. It's less about kind of predicting how they would rate this tool. It's more about they've just experienced it. Now we're going to grab as much information as possible to take from that. And it's also useful in the fact that from standard testing sessions, you may come away with a bunch of observations, but there's kind of rarely a solid metric that you can use. And I feel this is quite an important tool to maybe take to stakeholders, maybe use for benchmarking. You come out with a metric to say, this is how usable our users think our product is. Now let's build on it. And the second is around task level satisfaction. So the SUS survey tends to be used after entire experience of the product, whereas the task level tends to be used after each individual task. So there may be 20 steps in a usability study you ask our users to go through. This is a bit more heavy hitting in that you're kind of running a questionnaire after every task. And it may seem quite daunting, and I think it's important to position it right with users in that scenario. And the kind of the primary driving force behind this is that you're focusing on how effective a particular task is versus how effective the entire experience of a product is. So an example could be kind of a form completion and submitting some details. Could be a specific task that you want to kind of gauge adoption and usability metrics from. And I take the after scenario questionnaire as the example here. And again, it's based on a similar Likert scale. So 5 and 7 seem to be kind of sweet spots in terms of these questionnaires, and the kind of improvement to produce more quality results than, say, asking kind of a 10 option scale. So how have these been used in practice? I'm going to take through an example scenario. So this was taken from my time working with the student loans company. The title there kind of alludes to the fact that the product team was working under the same building as the users, essentially. So we had the entire assessment unit, call centers, kind of data entry advisors working alongside us as a product team, which I found was really unique in terms of any environment that I've been in before. So I really wanted to capitalize on that to get as much kind of insight as possible from these great people. To give you an idea of the environment, it's essentially kind of banks of desks of these assessors, kind of all gleaming with great insight that we can take from their process. Kind of want to sum up my feelings towards this environment. I mean, approaching any problem with internal users felt drastically different to kind of speaking to users kind of external who would typically use a website, say, or a public-facing product. And it was a really unique challenge for a number of reasons. I'm just going to kind of run through a few things that I took away from this. So start small and build relationships. So I say this because there's a lot of kind of pressure on these teams to deliver. Essentially, they're working round the clock and to the clock to kind of assess these loans using the software they have at their disposal, which, to be honest, was pretty poor in a lot of cases. So having that challenge to address all these issues with these products they were using, and also to understand their process, you have to kind of start small, speak to the kind of the team leads in that case, try and get that value across to them as to why you want to spend time with these people to understand their problems. Because essentially you're taking away potential time and money from the business by running these tests. So as I say, we started small, working with the team managers to kind of really show that value. So going to them with previous test results, previous prototypes that we've run, and previous optimizations that we've run with similar tools, we could kind of almost convince them that this was a good idea to invest in. And in the first instance, we would just shadow these assessors. So you maybe spend a day with somebody running data entry tasks just to really appreciate the amount of tools they have to use, amount of pressure they're under. And one thing I took upon myself to do is go through the training that they would go through. So when they joined the company to kind of learn how to data enter, I would kind of volunteer to run through that to really empathize with how they would kind of go about using these processes, tools, and work under this pressure. So I think throughout this process, having a strong empathy for what they're going through was certainly important. So once we kind of bedded in the value of running these tests, we kind of worked through prototypes to address the needs of these users, and we kind of came to this end product which we labeled Model Office. Now, essentially, Model Office was a usability test on a greater scale, so not too dissimilar to this. But it was essentially kind of taking a group of maybe 6 to 12 participants from the assessment teams, from the call centers, and spend the day with them in an exact environment as to what they're used to. So we would set up a desk in the same building, kind of within the surrounding of the other teams, and have them kind of run through their daily tasks using our prototype. And the interesting thing with this scenario is they would work both digitally and kind of with paper. So they would have the physical loan applications in one hand, and then they would be on the keyboard on the other hand, entering this data. So we knew that it wasn't just about improving the software they were using, but really understanding that kind of relationship between data entry and kind of digital assessment. And we ran these for a few weeks, and it was amazing some of the results we came out of this. I mean, it's during the sessions we would try and keep as hands off as possible. As many of you may know, it's hard not to influence people when they're using your product, because you kind of think, well, why aren't you clicking there? That's totally wrong. But kind of keeping hands off, having them jot down notes as they're working through it, having them scribble on the application forms themselves. All this information we took away from it really give us an understanding of how they worked, and crucially how our prototype kind of optimized their process to some degree. So to recap on that, some of the crucial tools we used in this scenario, so contextual inquiries, when we were shadowing these users, we kind of were picking up on a lot of behaviors in their own environment. We would run discovery workshops once we had that buy-in from the team stakeholders to really understand those issues and talk through what we found during those inquiries. Call listening, as I mentioned, there was a call center also in the building, so that was a great chance to kind of hear how they interacted with customers over the phone. So not only through data entry, but with dealing with these complaints that may come in from students or parents, and really kind of bringing that insight into what we delivered. And as I mentioned, the SUS survey, great tool if you haven't tried it. I recommend. So the outputs from these, so we got metrics for benchmarking, we got feedback to share with the team, and these paper forms I mentioned, we would review those to see how they made notes, and how we could potentially bring that into the system itself in some way. But crucially, I think the outcomes we got from this was more around relationships that we built. So we had that buy-in from stakeholders for future sessions. For me, this was the most important aspect, was the appreciation from participants. They kind of felt like they came along for the ride, so to speak, in terms of that product development process. They felt their needs were heard and they were met to some degree. And overall, an improved assessment process, which I can't give you the figures, but it has an impact on the business as a whole. So it was really valuable to run these sessions. Okay, so that's measure one. Second measure, I'm going to switch more to the company performance. So the first question, okay, so you've met the user needs. Are we meeting the business goals? You can't have one without the other, to be honest. You've got to make that case that you need both to make decisions. Essentially, that's what I'm saying. And yeah, you can't get away from things like revenue, profit, loss. The bottom line is for a lot of stakeholders and companies, they're going to be concerned with, is this going to save us money? Is this going to make us money? How's that going to affect our revenue? And how are you providing value to us in terms of spending time running these sessions? It's important to be aware of that to start with. Just switching gears, does anyone recognize this question? Show of hands. Okay, good. So a point of contention, but this is the question that leads into defining the NPS, or the Net Promoter Score, for a company. So as you may know, if you're familiar with it, it is the kind of segue into this 11-point scale where companies ask their customers how likely they are to recommend their service or product to a friend or a colleague. And then you're presented with this scale. The first thing to say for me is when I first saw this question, I thought, well, this is a binary answer. I'm either going to recommend or I'm not. I think the concept of an 11-point scale can be quite ambiguous. And not only that, but the results it produces are also fairly ambiguous as well. So if we look at 0 to 6, the first 7 are, if all of your customers say, right, I'm giving you a 6 because I'm happy with your product. I'll only give you a 7, but it's still a reasonable score. You're going to get a minus value out of that. It's not until you get into the passives, as they're known, that you start to kind of just hit that tipping point. And anything above that, you're going to start getting into the positive figures. So I'm not saying this isn't in no way a bad tool to use. I just feel like it can be used incorrectly in certain situations. I think it's great for companies to kind of just use as a benchmark to understand how they stack up over time, and it's a great way quick way for stakeholders to see how they're performing and how the teams are influencing that score. But for those people who are familiar with Jared and his words, you'll know he's fairly strong on his points, particularly around NPS. Being kind of a huge UX proponent, he does feel it is misused on many occasions. So it goes on. I mean, you only have to follow him on Twitter for a day to realize how he feels about it. So I do share some sentiments with Jared, but I do also feel the problem is it can be misused. Is what I've kind of taken from this. But as many metrics are, it's better to track something than doing nothing at all. So just to sum up that, so kind of asking someone about what they'll do in the future, i.e., would you recommend us to a friend? To me, that doesn't necessarily say loyalty. It's more about optimism in many respects. So kind of asking users to almost predict the future, it tends to be a lot more risky than having them dwell on previous experiences and give you kind of feedback in that sense. So yeah, I've often found that people kind of try to please too much as well in these situations, so you're never really going to get a true representation of a score when you ask for a prediction, in my opinion. So how do we approach that at a different angle? So enter the KIs. Pretty exciting, it's an acronym. So these are the key experience indicators. So these were defined, I believe, by the head of user research at Goldman Sachs. I forget the guy's name, but he's been around the block, and he's kind of proposed these indicators to use that focus more on user experience as opposed to kind of brand loyalty or kind of company perception. So I've taken 3 here. You'll probably notice the first one is kind of akin to what we were just talking around. So the A stands for actual. So he believes that this measure is an actual representation of Net Promoter Score as opposed to traditionally the single question. There's also a focus on kind of time around, time as a concept. So spending time to first action could be a good example. So how long does it take for users to hit that first action? That could be an indication that there's too much going on the page. The hierarchy is lost slightly. The CTA isn't obvious enough. There's a lot of things you can glean from that. And time on task, as I mentioned previously, is an interesting measure for kind of usability studies and the like. Okay, so the third measure is around team maturity. So as I mentioned, this kind of deals with how is your team, or how is your kind of design function, or product team as a whole functioning over time. So I do truly believe it's important to get this right in order to deliver the first 2 in many respects. So I'm just going to jump into to another big question. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, did you improve your design process from the last time you did a similar thing? it's a big question. I'm not going to try and answer it, but hopefully these tools will kind of be of use when you do so. So this is another from the KEIs. So this is the team empathy score. So this is all around essentially a percentage of your team who spent time with customers or users that week. So it could be there's a target for everyone in the team to observe your user base for maybe 30 minutes a week, just to get that understanding and that empathy and that appreciation of what people are going through when they use your product. You know, for me, I feel it's a great one. It's a great one to kind of broaden the scope of design in your company as well. It's almost as if you know, everyone is a part of this. Everyone needs to understand the users. It's not just those who work with the interface. It's affecting every aspect of that product and that journey. The maturity matrix is something that we've recently invested in heavily again, and it's essentially a way to visualize where you sit. I mean, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of a matrix, probably this as well. But the way we use it is kind of a way to visualize, typically from maybe a 0 to 5 scale, where your design team sits as far as maturity. So the way we would approach it is that you would almost shoot for the stars and say, okay, 5, what is the holy grail of design teams? How do we want that to look? You know, what are our practices? What are our processes? Who do we have in that team? How are we functioning? What are we learning? You know, and then you kind of go to 0 and say, right, this is no design focus whatsoever. Hopefully you're not at that end. But the idea is that you would set this stretch goal and say, this is not where we are now, but this is where we should be. So I think it's a good way to kind of be honest with yourself and take stock and say, well, are we really as good as we think? Are we really getting enough insight as we think? Are we really producing the designs that we can? So as I say, just being honest with yourself, I find is a good way to approach this. So to give you a few examples around how this has been implemented, I'm sure you're familiar with these guys. So they use, this is particularly focused to their engineering teams, but the concept remains. So they look at here as an engineer. Here are the kind of the 5 steps in the matrix that will get you to leadership. Have I read that wrong? Regardless, it's a way to kind of measure how you're progressing. Similar to, I believe the government has something in place which is of a similar vein. So we're kind of in good company to know that we're using these. If anyone wants to pull me up on this, please do. But yeah, I think it's a proven method that helps teams keep on track as to how they're performing. Just to give you an insight into some of ours. So on our design maturity matrix, these kind of reference some of the core, the fundamental kind of indicators that we use. So understanding of our users, confidence in making decisions, and consistency in design. So if we take the top one, for example, a 0 on the scale could be no understanding whatsoever of our users. We don't interact. We don't observe. Whereas 5 could be a complete understanding across the team. Everyone's aware of the user needs at all times. You know, we would have all the materials available, shared across the teams. You know, we would always reference personas, for example, and have user journeys in place. So this kind of gives you a feel for how we currently use it. I don't know how we're doing on time. I feel like I've rattled through that. But just to kind of leave you with a few takeaways, and I mean, who doesn't love a takeaway? So this is just kind of reiterating a point that I raised. I mean, I feel it's really important not to position user research as an optional kind of function of your team. The minute you do that, it kind of devalues it, I feel. So it's often seen as a nice to have. I guess it's an old kind of perception that it's an optional part of the design process. But I feel if it's hammered home and never positioned as an optional focus, then you know, it's going to be embedded in that culture going forward. And yeah, just measure something at all. I think it's, regardless of which metric you choose to use, I think it's just a good way of knowing that you're improving in some way. So just, I guess my advice is to start benchmarking and start measuring something. Yeah, thanks for listening. That's me.
Does anyone have any questions? me personally, only the first one of the 3 measures is what you focus on a lot of the time when you're making products. But I know I wrote something down. So the third one, definitely. Percentage of time with the users. I don't know. Like, how high is that supposed to be? Like, what's a good percentage to be with users?
So I think so. So I think something for the team, the wider team, I think it's important. I mean, I said 30 minutes per week. I guess that's an arbitrary number.
Right.
So that was an example I gave, but I guess the point was some exposure at least for everyone outside of the design function to truly appreciate that.
I'll think of the other thing.
Okay, cheers. Any other questions?
So you mentioned MPS and then AMPS, like the actual
Yes.
score. What was the difference between the two?
Good question. So I'll answer that in an example. So the AMPS was used by Netflix, I believe, in the past, and they kind of took that initial MPS question of predicting the future and kind of took it to almost reflecting on past events. So they split that into 2 questions, and they said, I think it was, have you recommended a friend in the past 6 months? Yes or no answer. And the second was, did you join Netflix through a recommendation? Again, yes or no answer. And I believe they found a fairly strong correlation between the answers to those 2 questions compared to kind of the spikes in their signups and referrals. So that was the main difference.
Well, that's like more like what you're saying about doing stuff in the past and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. I will say though with MPS, I didn't mention it there, but there is an option to give feedback. So if you are positioned as a detractor, as you say, typically then ask for a bit of feedback to kind of give context to why you gave that score. So I guess that's a crucial part as far as advancing the experience goes.
I work for the government, and what I tend to find is people tend to rate a service more favourably in terms of customer satisfaction when they've heard what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
So we have a service what says we charge you too much tax, here's the money back. Wonderful customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
The service what says you haven't paid enough tax, you owe us money. Terrible.
Yeah.
It's the same service, same design, same look and feel and stuff. So sometimes I'm not sure that customer satisfaction actually measures satisfaction in using the service.
Yeah.
I think it measures the satisfaction outcome of the service.
Yeah.
Does that jive with what everyone?
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to agree with your point there. I guess it's totally based on context, and the outcome, I suppose, is the crucial measure. Yeah.
I've seen that Java at School Twitter store.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, it's like 70-20.
Oh yeah.
But the NHS used to ask if people leaving hospitals, would you recommend this hospital to a friend? Well, that implies you want your friends to be in need of medical care.
Yeah.
So context is
Absolutely.
key, yes.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Any more questions?
Go back to the government thing you just said. How do you rate them in any other experiences in any other way besides satisfaction? Then, like, is there something you go, if this works, it's better, but it shouldn't do that?
Some government departments use Net Promoter Score, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And but a lot of people have started using this new thing, this Net Easy score.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Yeah.
like, how easy was it to do what you needed to do, rather than would you please predict the future?
Yeah.
Because do we really care if we want to recommend a friend in the future? More importantly, we need to know if they were able to do what they needed to do.
Yeah.
So customer satisfaction often doesn't reveal that,
Mm.
but Net Easy kind of does. Net Easy is essentially a SUS score.
Yeah.
So if you did SUS scores during your usability testing and then you use Net Easy and Grail, you can actually compare them because they actually measure the same thing. Whereas
Yeah.
NPS does not measure usability. It measures your ability to be a future teller.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It's weird because obviously when you leave a service, I'm really designed for like a service where when you leave a service, sometimes you get sent a text message saying, no, why did you leave? And then you get asked, would you recommend the service to thing? But unless there's genuine you're leaving because you're not having service. So
But at the same time, just email you when you don't finish ordering some food.
Hmm.
Oh, did you know you've left some things in your basket? Yeah, because I've decided to buy from someone else.
Yeah, there's an element of context and understanding the users.
Which
Which,
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't have a choice in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've worked in local government, so I have a slightly different problem to you in that before services go live, there's a lot of our services that we would really struggle to get user research on from actual users, because really no one wants to be a user tester for paying their council tax. And so in circumstances like that, where if we still want to do user research and we're maybe looking at, well, can we have someone almost proxy for them? So can we have internal staff who aren't related to that service at all, almost run through and essentially give them a scenario? Are there certain tests that you think, or certain measures that you think work better in that circumstance? So I was kind of thinking, is it something that you go way more quantitative, because like it's less likely that we'll say something really bad about their, well, they might be more likely to say something really bad about their own organisation. It's like, is there anything that's more or less valid if basically having someone pretend to be a user?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, it's getting someone as close to the kind of representative of user base as possible. I suppose if that's not possible, I wouldn't say I would necessarily change personally to a more qual-based study. I would still stick with the quant for the research. I mean, I don't really have an answer to that, but yeah, I guess it's a tough one. I've not really been in that scenario myself, to be honest.
How do you recruit users then for, say, like a student loan company?
Yeah.
Where is that like, hey, we'll pay you a load of money if you come and do it, or is it more like, well, proxy come? I don't know.
So it was, good question. I mean, essentially it was around kind of promoting what we were doing in the first instance. So although we were in the building, you know, I'm not afraid to say we might have had a bit of a bad rap because we were a bit more freedom maybe than some of the teams in there. So I guess the first instance was to just get time to speak to them, get time to speak to these teams, show them the value of what you do, just be totally transparent, and then kind of that slowly kind of fosters this good relationship, and just making sure that everyone's aware of what you do, and essentially we're all in this together. Sounds pretty cheesy, but the aim is to improve their lives, essentially, and then just building that over time, and it kind of it comes with that.
When I work in an agency, it's harder to convince people to do user testing.
Yeah. I mean, you do find people who are
improving their lives with things.
Yeah.
Like, your day will be way easier if you just help us out. Whereas we're like,
Yeah.
Client, do you want to pay more money to test? No, don't want to pay more. Just give me the products. You know.
Yeah, I mean, you will get people who resist it, and with experience from kind of one-to-one interviews with internal users, you'll get people who just kind of shut you out completely. They're not interested. They're only there because I don't know, maybe suggested a voucher, or the boss has given them extra time off. Obviously, you will find people who resist that. But you know, for every one person, there's somebody else who wants to participate. So it's just finding that, I believe. Cheers.